Okay, guys, so we're going to be going over the Soviet Union under Stalin. Okay. Our first question in this is, what happened to Lenin's body? You remember from the end of the last section we read that as the Bolshevik Revolution, as the Communist Revolution took hold and during this, after the Civil War in Russia, Vladimir Lenin died at some point, and there was a transfer of power. And there were a number of people who were sort of jostling for position, jostling for power there. And one of them's name was Trotsky. And Trotsky was responsible for reforming Russia's armed forces. He got the Red Army in ship shape and ready to fight during their civil war. But another was Joseph Stalin. And Stalin, he was just a really good political operator. He was good at politics, and he ended up seizing power of the Communist Party. So in January 1924, tens of thousands of people lined up in Moscow's historic Red Square. They had come to view the body of Lenin, who had died a few days earlier. His widow wanted to bury him next to his mother, but the Communist Party officials, including Joseph Stalin, wanted to preserve Lenin's body and put it on permanent display. In the end, his body was displayed for more than 65 years. By preserving the body, Stalin wanted to show that he would carry on the goals of the Communist Revolution. However, in the years that followed, he used ruthless measures to control the Soviet Union and its people. So Lenin's body was put on display for 65 years, so Stalin could use it to show he was continuing the revolution. Number two, this takes place under a totalitarian state. It says, what had Marx predicted would happen to the state? And what actually happened? So let's go back and talk about Karl Marx really quick. We remember from our study of the Industrial Revolution that there were a number of thinkers, political philosophers, who had new ideas on the role of government and what people's governments should look like and what a government's responsibilities were. And they were all over the place. We had Smith, who actually came from an earlier time. His ideas were even earlier, who said that the role of government is to stay out of the way and let business do business, right? Laissez-faire economics. We had some people who sort of followed that, guys by the name of like Thomas Malthus and Ricardo. They believed that helping people would only make more miserable people. We had the thinker Jeremy Bentham, and Bentham said that the purpose of government is to just solve problems for people. To basically, the most useful government is the good one, without boiling it down too much. But we had another couple of thinkers. We had Robert Owen, who came up with the idea of socialism, which we came to call utopian socialism. But we had these others. Their names were Friedrich Engels and Karl Marx. Okay, and they believed that the workers of the Industrial Revolution would rise up and eliminate the bourgeoisie class, that they would take over the factories, and that the people working in the factories would own the factories, and the people working in the coal mines would own the coal mines, and so on. I mean, this is kind of the idea that Marx had, and to some degree Owen believed in this. And it came to be called communism. So here in our reading, it says Karl Marx had predicted that under communism, the state would eventually wither away. So that the workers' control of the factories, the workers' control of their homeland would eventually override the idea of a nation or a country or a state, that idea would disappear. Okay. Karl Marx predicted that under communism, the state would eventually wither away. But under Stalin, the opposite occurred. He turned the Soviet Union into a totalitarian state controlled by a powerful and complex bureaucracy. So he predicted the state would wither away, Marx did, and Stalin made the opposite happen. He turned it into a totalitarian state, a place that was awful to live, and people were ruled by fear rather than people ruling their own workplaces. Number 3 asks us, what is a command economy and how does it compare to a free market economy? This idea, this question is going to be the subject of our entire Cold War unit that's coming up. We're going to be talking about comparing these two ideas, but for now, it's enough to just define. The Soviet Union developed a command economy, where the government officials made all economic decisions. By contrast, in a capitalist system, in a free market economy, the free market determines the economic decisions. Privately owned businesses compete to win the customer's choice. So customers decide what's going to happen in a free market, where in a command economy, the government decides what's going to happen. And that's what we wrote here, right? The command economy, government officials make the decisions. In a free market, the market determines the decisions. The customers do. Number 4, how did the government push workers and managers to meet production goals? So let's look in mixed results in industry. Stalin's 5-year plans set high production goals, or quotas, especially for heavy industry and transportation. The government pushed workers and managers to meet these goals by giving bonuses to those who succeeded and by punishing those who did not. So that was their strategy, right? Bonuses to the people who meet the quotas and punishments for those who did not. Now, the kinds of punishments we would see would probably depend on just how badly they performed. It would be nothing to basically just fire them from the job and tell them you're no good anymore on this. Okay. So, yeah, bonuses and punishments. How did managers respond? Well, remember, we're talking about quotas, right? Despite impressive progress in some areas, Soviet workers had little to show for their efforts. Some peasants did become skilled factory workers or managers. Overall, though, the standard of living remained low. Central planning was inefficient. It caused shortages in some areas and surpluses in others. But here's the strategy they used, right? Many managers, concerned only with meeting production quotas, turned out large quantities of low-quality goods, okay? So if you're a factory manager in Soviet Russia, your whole outlook would be to, say you're the manager of a shoe factory, right? And you get orders from the Communist Party that says, hey, we need 100,000 pairs of shoes. And you know that you don't have enough workers to turn out 100,000 pairs of shoes this year. You just don't know how to do it unless you really, really cut some corners and you start making shoes that maybe the laces are too short or something. And so what they would do is they would churn out hundreds of thousands of pairs of shoes, and the shoes would be nearly useless. They would be very, very low quality. And so as a result, under the communist system, this whole quota system, there were lots and lots of very poor quality goods. Okay, some goods you couldn't get at all, but the goods that you could get were low quality. And that's one of the strongest critiques of central planning, strongest critiques of this command economy. So they were concerned only with meeting quotas, large quantities of low quality. And we already covered how the 5-year plans affected the standard of living, okay? Right. Consumer products were scarce, okay? You could get, 10 pairs of useless shoes, but you couldn't get one refrigerator. So the standard of living remained low, and some consumer products like clothing were scarce. You couldn't get enough of the things you wanted. Okay? Standard of living remained low, and products like clothing, cars, and refrigerators were scarce. Wages were low, and the wages were low. And ironically, even though the Soviets were originally formed as sort of kind of a labor union, right? Under Stalin, under these 5-year plans, the workers couldn't strike. So the whole idea of power to the people was completely removed. So Stalin didn't just do this with industry. He also took this sort of approach with agriculture. Stalin also brought agriculture under government control, but at a horrendous cost. The government wanted farmers to produce more grain to feed to workers in the cities. But it also hoped to sell that grain abroad to earn money. I'm going to say that again. They hoped to sell the grain to earn money. Now, this is tough because that assumes that they have enough grain to sell. And we're going to see how this plays out in the future here. Who owned the machinery, the animals, and the land? Under Lenin's new economic plan, peasants had held on to small plots of land. This is the old, the Bolshevik system, right? The new economic plan. Many had prospered. But Stalin saw that system as being inefficient, and he saw it as a threat to state power. Stalin wanted all peasants to farm on either state-owned farms or collectives, which were large farms that were owned and operated by peasants as a group. On collectives, the government provided tractors, fertilizer, and better seed. And peasants would learn modern farm methods. Peasants would be permitted to keep their houses and personal belongings, but the farm animals and the implements were to be turned over to the collective, so given to government control, right? The state set all prices and controlled access to farm supplies. So who owned the machinery, the animals, and the land? It was either the communist government or the collective, which was just more communist government, right? So the government owned all the machinery and animals and equipment through the form of the collective. How did peasants resist? Well, of course, if the government owns all the animals, well, the peasants did not want to give up their land, and they didn't want to sell their crops at low prices, right? The state was buying low and selling it abroad. They were selling it for more money to other countries. They resisted collectivization. They killed farm animals, they destroyed tools, and they burned crops. Stalin was furious. He believed that kulaks, or wealthy farmers, were behind the resistance. I want to talk about these kulaks really briefly. When we talked about the French Revolution, we talked about nobles and the landlords, the people who owned the farms. This is sort of equivalent. These kulaks are sort of equivalent. These are the people who owned large farms, right? Wealthy farmers, people who had done fairly well. Stalin blamed it on them. Okay? He believed that they were behind it, and he responded with brutal force. In 1929, Stalin declared his intention to, quote, liquidate the kulaks as a class. Okay? He was destroying what he saw as the rural nobility. They confiscated the kulaks' land and sent the kulaks to labor camps. So they would be sent to, Siberia or someplace to the gulag. We'll talk about those a little more in the future here. But thousands were killed or died from overwork. So the peasants resisted by killing animals, destroying tools, and burning crops. And Stalin freaked out. I mean, he went nuts and he killed a bunch of kulaks. The next question is, after this, quote, dekulakization, how did peasants resist? Even after the dekulakization, angry peasants resisted by growing just enough food to feed themselves. In response, Stalin and the government seized all of their grain to meet the industrial goals, purposely leaving the peasants to starve. Okay. His goal was to bring them to heel. He wanted to control them, and he was willing to starve them to death to do that. And this didn't just happen to a few people, okay? In 1932, this ruthless policy, it happened at the same time as legitimately bad harvests, it led to a terrible famine. Later, this was called the Terror Famine. It caused between 5 and 8 million people to die of starvation in the Ukraine alone. Okay, when you talk about the killing of 5 to 8 million people, we're talking about genocide. We're talking about events that are similar to the Armenian genocide that we talked about during World War I. And this is similar to the Holocaust that we will talk about during World War II. This is the wholesale killing of huge parts of a population. And he did it with starvation. So how did peasants resist? Well, they resisted by growing just enough food to feed themselves. And the government, it seized the grain. What grain they did grow, they took it to sell it, to meet industrial goals, to send it to the factories where the workers could eat it and, make more tanks and industrial stuff. Okay. This purposely left the peasants to starve, and this was known as the terror famine. As a matter of fact, we'll talk about this when we talk about totalitarianism, but these events might be among the largest mass killings of human beings in the history of the world. The terror famine was an enormous death toll. It was probably more dead than other events in world history. There was another one that took place in China that we'll talk about that was very similar. But yeah, it starved a lot of people. Hunger as a weapon is a real thing. So question 10 asks us, did collectivization, did making these people team up and grow crops together, did it improve farm output? Okay. Although collectivization increased Stalin's control of the peasantry, it did not improve farm output. During the 1930s, grain production inched upward, but meat, vegetables, and fruit remained in short supply. Feeding the population would remain a major problem in the Soviet Union. They had taken away farmers' incentive to grow enough food to feed everybody. And then once they had taken the incentive to grow enough food to feed everybody, the farmers stopped growing so much food, and then it just took the food that they did grow and let them starve to death. So now you don't even have farmers to grow the food. So this is there was an existing agricultural cycle that was taking place in Russia at the time, and it got completely ruined. It got broken by collectivization and by the wrath of Joseph Stalin. So no, collectivization did not improve farm output. Okay? There was not enough food in the Soviet Union. Stalin's terror tactics. In addition to tactics like the terror famine, Stalin's Communist Party used secret police, torture, and violent purges to ensure obedience. Now, let's not run away with the idea of a purge. We're going to talk about what a purge actually is. I know you guys have a conception of that based on movies that have come out recently, but that's not at all what a purge is when we talk about it in a historical sense. Stalin tightened his grasp on every aspect of Soviet life, even stamping out any signs of dissent within the communist elites. So 3 things he did to use terror, okay, to ensure obedience. He perpetrated crimes against humanity and systematically violated people's individual rights. Okay, spies would open private letters or plant listening devices on people. Nothing was allowed to appear in print, and so there was no free press. There was no method of voicing protest. And anyone who complained about the system, who complained about communism, or who complained about things like, the terror famine, they would be sent to the Gulag, which is a system of brutal labor camps. So I'm going to talk about those in a second, but secret police, torture, and violent purges. But I want to show you guys the gulags. Okay, if someone didn't like the Communist Party, they were sent to one of these forced labor camps. Okay, A gulag is a forced labor camp. And it's worth talking about what this means. So a forced labor camp isn't necessarily, someone mentioned North Korea. We'll talk about that in a second. Yes. As a matter of fact, if you look over here, right, we're in the neighborhood of North Korea. It's no wonder where they got this idea. So the Russians, if someone was an enemy of Russia, right, if someone was an enemy of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union, then the approach, the thing that they used was to basically send them to work to death. Right? I mean, a gulag labor camp, its purpose was to punish. But while they were punishing people, they were having them do back-breaking work because they also needed some back-breaking work done. And so the whole idea of the gulag was basically to work someone to death or work someone into submission. Okay? If you needed coal mined, well, you would just go and build a gulag labor camp around the coal, and you would, you know, point guns at the people and say, hey, go mine the coal, and boom, you have a gulag. And that's what these gulags were. So some of these were like industrial. Some of these, like the ones around Moscow, these might have been factories where people were forced to work. Some of these were, no doubt, were coal mines or iron mines where people were forced to work. But the people doing this work, they might not have been getting paid. They might have been doing this for almost nothing, for fear of being, you know, shot or killed or whatever. This was punishment. And this is what would happen to people who did not do exactly what the communists expected, what they wanted. Yeah, violated people's individual rights. Some ways that communists violated people's individual rights. Again, there was no press, no protest. The police opened people's letters, and critics were sent to the gulag. Let's talk about violent purges. Let's talk about the Great Purge here. Although Stalin's power was absolute, he still feared that rival party leaders were plotting against him. He thought that other communists were powerful enough to take control from him. Okay. The reason he might have felt this was because that's exactly what he did to Trotsky. He pushed Trotsky out, and so he knew it would be possible for someone to do that to him. In 1934, Stalin launched the Great Purge. During this reign of terror, Stalin and his secret police cracked down especially on old Bolsheviks, or party activists from the early days of the revolution. So he went after the people who agreed with him, the people who idealized the same things that he idealized, but were a threat to him. So this is who he went after. He went after people who he thought might plot against him. Now, this is different than the purge you guys heard about in the movies, right? In history, when we talk about a purge, sort of the ideal type or the typical way that a purge would work would be, you know, the king has 3 sons, and then when the king dies, you know, the one son decides, hey, if I want to keep this kingdom, I have to kill my brothers, and he would just go along, you know, pruning his family tree. He would kill off any rivals to his claim to the throne. And that's like the classical idea of a purge. And so that's what a purge is. It's eliminating people who challenge the supremacy of a political leader. And that's exactly what Stalin did, is he went along and he killed or sent to gulags any people who he thought would challenge him. This is a tradition that goes back in Russian politics. It goes back to the time of the czars and to the time of the Ancien regime with the nobles and the clergy and all that. But it's one that definitely continued through into Stalin's idea of Russian communism. What were the show trials? Between 1936 and 38, Stalin staged a series of spectacular public, quote, show trials in Moscow. Former communist leaders, these old Bolsheviks, right, they confessed to all kinds of crimes after being tortured or having their families threatened, okay? Many of the Purge Party members were never tried, but were just sent straight to the gulag, right? Secret police files reveal that at least 4 million people were purged during the Stalin years. Some historians estimate the toll to be much greater. So here we have the terror famine, where lots of poor peasants are starved to death on purpose, right? And here we have the Great Purge, where some 4 million people were just, killed or worked to death in an effort to just keep power in Russia. All of this because, people were tired of fighting in World War I and getting killed. So we're going to see here that often during revolutions, people end up with the same thing that they started with, except for there's a huge body count. We saw that with the French Revolution. They started out with an absolute king, and they ended up with an absolute emperor. Same, just a huge body count, and 16,000 people killed in the streets of Paris by the guillotine. So, the show trials. Stalin staged a series of public show trials where former communist leaders confessed to all kinds of crimes after being tortured or having their families threatened. The results of the purge, the results of this reign of terror. Yeah. The purges definitely did work to increase Stalin's power. All Soviets were now well aware of the consequences of disloyalty. Stalin's government paid a heavy price, though. Among the people that were purged were experts in industry, economics, and engineering. And many of the Soviet Union's most talented writers and thinkers. Importantly, though, the victims of this purge included most of the nation's military leaders and about half of its military officers. Remember, Stalin came to power by pushing out Trotsky, who was a military leader. So he already had a bit of a distrust with the military leadership. And so when he did his purges, they got a lot of that. Okay. I have to say, with the benefit of hindsight, we can see that Stalin made a huge mistake by killing off his military leadership because he didn't expect World War II, which was what was going to happen soon after this. Okay. The loss as a result of the Great Purge, it weighed heavily on Stalin in 1941 when Germany invaded the Soviet Union. Sorry about that. So the purge killed off many of the intelligent people and leaders that Stalin would need when World War II began. So communist attempts to control thought. And first we're going to talk about propaganda. At the same time he was purging any elements of resistance in Soviet society and on Soviet farms, right? Stalin also tried to control the hearts and minds of Soviet citizens. He tried to do this by tirelessly distributing propaganda, censoring opposing ideas, and imposing Russian culture on minorities, and replacing religion with communist ideology. Propaganda. Stalin tried to boost morale and faith in the communist system by making himself into a godlike figure. He used propaganda as a tool to build up a, quote, cult of personality around himself. Using modern technology, the party bombarded the public with relentless propaganda. So what is propaganda? Radios and loudspeakers blared into factories and villages. In movies, theaters, and schools, citizens heard about communist success and the evils of capitalism. Billboards and posters urged workers to meet or exceed production quotas. Headlines in the official communist newspaper, Pravda, which Pravda, it translates to truth, which is really super ironic. It linked enemies at home to foreign agents that were trying to overthrow the communist regime. So the idea of propaganda is basically loudspeakers being shouted into people's homes saying, hey, the communist government is great. We're providing for you. Everyone's doing well. Nobody's hungry. Everybody's happy. There's definitely not a terror famine going on. We're definitely not purging anyone who disagrees with us. This place is awesome. It was a way of saying what they wanted people to believe to be true and thinking that, well, that would make people believe that it's true. And this is a tactic that's still used today. Someone in the chat brought up North Korea. We were talking about forced labor camps. Okay, North Korea definitely still uses forced labor camps. Okay, if anyone disagrees with the North Korean leadership, then yeah, they are almost for sure sent to a labor camp, and they will almost for sure starve to death there, or be worked to death, or just be beaten to death or shot there. But another thing that North Korea still uses is this propaganda. Okay, we're gonna see how this plays out in Russia, and just know that this still happens in places like North Korea. And we shouldn't let China off the hook, because this is definitely also sort of happening in China as well, although maybe to not as much as it used to. So examples of how people were bombarded with propaganda: the loudspeakers blaring into factories and villages. The party newspaper called Truth, it linked enemies at home to foreign enemies. I don't know if, I know you guys are ninth graders, but it should be laughable to you that a newspaper whose whole purpose is to lie about how awesome things are, that the name of the newspaper is Truth. That's sort of ironic. It just makes you think, if someone tells you, hey, we're being totally fair, and we're totally giving you all the facts, that should be a red flag for you that they're probably doing the opposite. Okay, if anyone claims to be absolutely infallibly telling you the truth, then chances are they're telling you, yeah, not truth. They're lying outright. So yeah, those are examples of propaganda. And so how did the government treat books, music, and art? So we'll talk about this in a second here. We're going to skip over Russianization, although it was definitely a real thing. It was a real problem. I don't want to get into the whole cultural stuff here with the diversity of the Soviet Union and how they were, yeah. So at first, the Bolshevik Revolution had meant greater freedom for Soviet artists. Under Stalin, however, the heavy hand of state control gripped the arts. The government controlled what books were published, what music was heard, and which works of art were displayed. The communists and Stalin required artists to create their works in socialist realism. Its goal was to show Soviet life in a positive light and promote hope in the communist future. It made artists become part of the propaganda. So here are works of art that are socialist realism, and some of these are Chinese socialist realism. But here we see, proud Russian soldier. This is World War II. World War II. So this is a later work. Where was the one with the? Mr. Wayne found a really good one earlier, and I forgot to bookmark it. Here you've got Stalin being, some great smart guy, right? There was one with Stalin and some roses. the smallest possible version of that one. But we can see that its purpose was to paint communism in the best possible light, right? This was created with the purpose of promoting socialism, promoting the Communist Party. Here's our great, wonderful leader who definitely cares about us, and look how great he looks in his uniform, even though he never probably fired a gun. It was a whole lot of that, right? So artists were first forced to work in the socialist realism style, which wasn't realistic, and it made them a part of the propaganda. It made them a part of the tools of manipulating people's minds. I really want to find the... Why is this being so difficult? I really wanted to show you guys this painting. Hopefully you can see it fairly well. It's a bunch of children presenting roses to Stalin. It's like, look, even the children love him. It's kind of the message that it's trying to send.
I can't find the link that I sent you earlier.
That's okay. I'm going to move on because we're going long on time and I'm recording anyway. So the next part we're going to talk about is the war on religion and the Communist Party's war on religion. So this the heading sort of hints at the question here: how did the Communist Party try to strengthen their control over the minds of people? So here, this is the Russification. This is talking about how basically the communists wanted all the other members of the union to act more Russian. That's definitely important, but we have to skip over something or we go way, way long. Here it is. Here's the children giving, dear leader, his roses, right?
Hey, if the children liked him enough to give him roses, he must be a good guy.
He must be a good guy. Look, he kissed a baby. Yeah. All right, so the Communist Party also tried to strengthen its hold on the minds of people by destroying their religious faith, or more accurately, by replacing their religious faith. In accordance with the ideas of Marx, atheism, or the belief that there is no God, became an official state policy. Okay. What did I just do? Yeah. So the Communist Party tried to control people's minds by replacing their faith, their very faith in whatever they held most dear, whatever ideas they thought were most supreme in their minds. They wanted to replace those with the ideas of communism. Okay, so they sought to destroy or even replace their religious faith with faith in communism. And so the official state policy for religion was atheism. It was against the law to be devout in the Soviet Union. So let's read a little more about that. Early on, the Bolshevik communists, the early communists, targeted the Russian Orthodox Church, which had strongly supported the Tsars. Many priests and other religious leaders were among those killed in purges or sent to die in gulags. Other religions were persecuted as well. At one show trial, 15 priests were charged with teaching religion to the young, which was against the law. It was a counter-revolutionary activity. The state seized Jewish synagogues and banned the use of Hebrew. So the official communist viewpoint on religion, including Catholicism and Judaism, was they were against it, right? And so when we talk about the persecution of the Jewish people in history, it's easy to forget that even though the Russians were fighting against the Germans in World War II, that a lot of this anti-Jewish, this anti-Semitic, a lot of these ideas, they might have come from some of the philosophies of some of the Russian people, of the Russian leadership of the Bolsheviks here. So worth considering. Islam was also officially discouraged. The communists tried to replace religion with their own ideology. Like a religion, communist ideology had its own, quote, sacred texts. The writings of Karl Marx and Vladimir Lenin, and its own shrines, like the tomb of Lenin. Portraits of Stalin replaced religious icons in Russian homes. This is something we still see in North Korea. So in North Korea, if you go to someone's home, somewhere in their home, they will have a shrine to the communist leader of their nation. Okay. However, millions of Soviets continued to worship in private and sometimes in public in defiance of the government's prohibitions. So the sacred texts of communism included the works of Marx and Lenin. Okay, so what did the communists replace the old social order with? Okay. The terror and cultural coercion of Stalin's rule made a mockery of the original theories and promises of communism. The lives of most Russians did change. Let's go back. So making a mockery of the ideals that started the revolution, this reminds us again of the French Revolution. At the beginning of the revolution, we had people who were tired of an absolute monarch, and they were tired of a system that was unfair to the poor people, to the sans-culottes. And then in the middle of that revolution, we saw the rise of the Committee of Public Safety, you know, Robespierre and this ruthless madman who was willing to censor people and kill people and purge people. And then there was a second revolution along with that where Napoleon took charge. And Napoleon, again, he censored people and killed people and ruled over people with spies and with authoritarianism. So we see that this happens in the communist revolution as well. So the communists destroyed the old social order of landowning nobles at the top and peasants at the bottom. But instead of creating a society of equals, as they promised, they created a society where a few new elites emerged as a ruling class. At the head of this society were, instead of ancient nobility, they were members of the Communist Party. Only a small fraction of Soviet citizens could join the party. Many who did so were motivated by a desire to get ahead rather than a belief in communism. Okay. The elite enjoyed benefits denied to most people. They might be able to get access to, you know, a fruit or a vegetable sometimes. They lived in the best apartments and they would rest at the best vacation homes in the summertime. They could shop at special stores for scarce consumer goods. So if you were Russian and you wanted a refrigerator, well, then you'd better be someone important in the Communist Party. On the other hand, Stalin's purges often fell on the elite. He didn't usually purge the people who didn't have anything anyway, but the other powerful people. Okay, so the communists replaced the old social order with a new social order that was at least as bad. It was just more confusing. So what did people get free from the communist government? Okay. Although excluded from party membership, most people did enjoy several new benefits. The party required all children to attend free communist-built schools. The state supported technical schools and universities as well. So what did they get? They got education for free. Okay. Communist Party set up programs for students outside of school, including sports, cultural activities, and political classes. In addition to important skills, schools taught about communist values like atheism, the glory of collective farming, and the magnificence of their dear leader, Stalin, right? Other things that were provided for free included medical care, daycare for children, housing, and public recreation. While these were real benefits, many people still lacked vital necessities. Although the state built massive apartment complexes, housing was scarce. Entire families might be packed into a single room. Bread was plentiful. You could always get bread, but meat, fresh fruit, and other foods remained in short supply. So people got education, medical care, inexpensive housing, but there was never enough of it. And things that people wanted were almost non-existent, and the things that people needed were kind of hard to come by. The schools, they taught trades and they taught people lots of things, but along with that, they taught them communist values like atheism and a reverence for the state. Okay. We are unfortunately going to skip over women in the Soviet Union. I'll quickly say that women were an important driving force in the revolution, that early in the revolution, their inputs were considered fairly well, and that later in the revolution, under totalitarianism, later in Russia, they were excluded again. We won't get into that a whole lot. Normally, I get into the women's section of every section and chapter and unit, but this is long now, and I really want to I want to wrap this up. I want to talk about the Comintern. So what was the purpose of the Comintern? Its purpose of the Comintern was to encourage worldwide communist revolution. To this end, it aided revolutionary groups around the world and urged colonial people to rise up against their imperialist masters, right? So it was to promote revolution outside of Russia. Well, that's a lot. The Red Scare. The Comintern supported revolutionary groups outside of the Soviet Union, and its propaganda against capitalism made Western powers highly suspicious of the Soviet Union. In the United States, fear of Bolshevik plots led to the, quote, Red Scare in the early 1920s. So it was a fear. It was a fear of communist revolution in the Americas, in North America. It was a fear of the spread of communism. There's a whole American history unit that deals with how America reacted to the Red Scare and how the Red Scare took place. I don't really get into that as much because I don't talk much about American history. And how did the Soviet Union scheme against Britain? In 1926, there was a labor strike in Britain. It was a large labor strike. And the Soviet Union tried to turn this into a communist revolution in Britain. And so, of course, Britain and the Soviet Union had a falling out. Okay. So the communists took power. They struggled for power. And towards the end of this section, we see that their attempt is to spread that power. This threat of the spread of communism is where we will pick up on this when we start to talk about the Cold War in a later unit. Okay, first we're going to stop and talk about, first we're going to do a unit on World War II and the rise of totalitarianism. But along the way, and after that, we will talk about this struggle for a command economy versus a free market economy. All right, and the differing political and economic philosophies.